So Deirdre, welcome. It's great to see you.
Well, I'm glad to be here at Cato.
So I've been thinking about how to start this interview, and it occurred to me in a sort of playful way. Let us transport ourselves into 2024 or 2025, and you get the phone call from the Nobel Prize Committee in Oslo, and it's the big news.
Yeah.
You know, these prizes tend to be accompanied with a short statement about what people have accomplished in their academic work. What would a statement like that say about you?
Well, if it was done well, and I would hope they would, although they would say that I've proposed and to some degree proven a new theory, which is also an old theory, of why we're rich. Why the world went from $2 a day in current prices in 1800, worldwide. You know, if you were a king or a high priest, you were higher than that, but the average person, $2 a day for consumption, up to $45 a day on average now. And my explanation is not railways or trade or even legal change or institutions particularly, but is ideas. In particular, the master idea of liberalism. The idea that we should be adults, free adults, that no one should be a slave. The idea that hierarchy naturalized, we'd say in the English department, naturalized hierarchy. That is, oh, you're just a peasant, you stay a peasant, I'm the Lord, shut up. That kind of stuff started to, how can I say, started to erode, at least in people's minds, theorists' minds. Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, Voltaire, started to erode in the 1700s. And that, I claim, is what gave people the permission, equality of permission, to invent the modern world. It's in a way, it's completely obvious because, after all, if you decide to go downtown today, it happens in your head. It doesn't happen in your big toe. It happens in your mind. So any change, any innovation has to be in people's mind. And the big innovation was liberalism, which gradually took hold in the 19th century and the 20th. Gradually, people were freed from being slaves.
Given that this interview will be seen in different geographical areas, we should probably define liberalism, because there is a difference between how Europeans think about quote-unquote liberalism and Americans do.
Absolutely. I'm using the word in the original European way. You might call it classical liberalism. John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, that kind. Whereas in the United States, it became, in the last 100 years, to mean essentially social democracy.
Mm-hmm. Or more progressivism, almost.
Progressivism. In fact, that was the name for it 100 years ago.
I read somewhere that it was as a result of the disaster of the Woodrow Wilson administration that progressives sort of said, we no longer want to be called progressives, we want to be called liberals, because back then it still had a certain cachet, that word. Am I wrong on that?
No, I don't think you are. I think that's true. But the idea of the so-called new liberalism, which would be another specifically American and British phrase, began in the 1880s in Britain, where instead of saying, we're all going to be adults now, you're free, you're not going to be a slave, the new liberalism, which was actually anti-liberal, was said, well, but we in the government, we know what you want, or what's good for you. So I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, was the new mantra. And that the great Liberal Party in Britain moved more and more that way by under Lloyd George, for example, in the early 20th century, it was very much welfarist.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we also have to distinguish between new liberalism of the 1880s, say, and then neoliberalism, which comes 100 years later, and it's called, well, neoliberalism as interpreted.
It's kind of that neoliberalism word is kind of a swear word on the left. Our friends, and I have lots of friends on the left. I was once on the left. I was once a socialist when I was a kid. That means an aggressive foreign policy, for example, of a sort that I don't approve of. I don't think the United States having 800 military bases around the world, as it does, is a good idea. I just don't think, So I'm a liberal, 19th century style. I'm for liberty. And I don't think the state, the government, should be big and powerful. I think it should be small and competent. And just one more thing about this terminology, this word that everyone wants to take over and change into their own thing. In Latin America, liberal tends to mean pro-business policies to enrich already rich people imposed by the army. So it doesn't mean freedom from hierarchy, because the army's on top and it says, no, we're gonna do it this way. That's the tragedy of modern Chile.
Yeah, and classical liberals obviously believe in competition in the markets. They don't believe in supporting big businesses.
They don't. In fact, for instance, take a recent case, Mariana Mazzucato, a very intelligent young economist. She advocates industrial policy, and people as diverse as, a lot of United States politicians have said, oh yeah, we gotta have industrial policy, which consists of the somewhat strange idea when you think about it, that a bureaucrat in Washington or London or Paris can do a better job of deciding whether to put up a new building in Chicago or Birmingham or Bordeaux than someone on the scene, or to start a new line of research better than the scientists or engineers doing the research.
Yeah. I do have a lot of friends on the sort of solutionist or techno-optimist side of the debate who are quite attracted to the notion of the government spending much more money on R&D.
Yeah.
I understand their point, but my response to them always is, if there was one lesson that we have learned during the Cold War in the struggle between the communist system and the capitalist system, is that top-down allocation of resources, including capital, simply doesn't work because the bureaucrat doesn't know where the innovation is going to come from.
I'm a Anglican, and we call it Episcopalian in the United States, but we're sort of Catholic light is what they call us. And there's a Catholic social teaching, which I approve of, not the whole of it, but this one item, about, what's the word they use? Subsidiarity, which says the decision, any decision about anything, should be made at the lowest level that it can be done competently at.
Closest to the people.
Closest to the people. So we've done in the United States a good deal of privatizing of, say, garbage disposal, trash collection. Now there's a tendency for it to be corrupt, but still, imagine if trash collection in the United States were governed from Washington. I mean, it would not work very well, I can pretty much guarantee. And the same thing holds. I see it. I have such a hard time with my friends on the left because they don't get this, and I don't know quite why. They think that business is easy. I suppose that's part of it. They're professors and journalists and so on, and they sort of think, oh, well, running a small business or a large one must be, that's for stupid people. We, clerisy as I call them, we intellectuals and writers and preachers and so on, we're the smart ones, and they're so it must be that business is easy.
But also, I wonder if there is a sort of rejection of profit and the notion that if you leave the private sector and you become part of government, a public official, somehow you have completely gotten rid of all the personal desires and biases, that somehow you are turned into a human robot.
That's right.
Who will just make the right calls depending on evidence and rationality. That's not how it is it?
That's a very strong feeling on the left and to some degree on the right, in another key, as sort of in musical terms. But yeah, the people will say, we in a functioning democracy like the United States have voted for these people in Washington. So that takes care of it. They must be our servants. We say a public service. And as you said, the theory of the public servants is that they're just really nice and very smart. And I have cousins who work for the government, and they're very nice and very smart. But you can't be that smart to solve what Friedrich Hayek called the knowledge problem, which is that I know what kind of ice cream I like, and someone remote, way far away, doesn't know what kind of ice cream I like. And so the best way of getting that message that I like, actually, vanilla, it is through prices, through bids, so that I put my money where my mouth is and buy vanilla. And then that gets transmitted, that information, as though by an invisible hand, gets transmitted back to the ice cream maker. What's it called? John and Jerry's? What's
Ben and Jerry's.
Ben and Jerry's. They keep trying out new flavors. And when they find that castor oil ice cream is not popular, they drop it because no one buys it.
Right. So Matt Ridley likes to talk about the fact that every day in London, 10 million people get their lunch. But there is not a lunch commissar who knows or can calculate how many avocados London needs every day, or how many pounds of turkey or whatever things simply work out through the spontaneous workings of the market. One day you have too little ham, so you order a little more until you
That's right.
get to
And the
point.
same thing holds for many other parts of our lives. Language, for example, is a spontaneous order. There's no commissar of language, of the English language or the Spanish language. It evolves. We try out new expressions. Every teenage girl in the United States says, whatever, meaning I dismiss that. And that came from the valley outside of Los Angeles or in Los Angeles a long time ago. And the same is true of friendship. There's no commissar of friendship. We make our friends, and we have a circle of friends, and the same is true of art and music and science. They're all spontaneous orders. And see, the thing is that people forget. It's sort of like the old story of the fish in the water doesn't know there's water, so to speak. He just does his fish life without thinking he's in water. And we have spontaneous orders all over the place, yet we think there are only two things. There's my action, I raise my arm as a philosophical example, my single action, and there's top-down governance. But actually, most of our life is in the middle here. And a free society is one in which art and science and friendship and language and the economy can spontaneously evolve.
You said that some of your friends, maybe members of your family, work in the public sector. You say they are not stupid, they are maybe
nice.
hardworking and all that
And
jazz.
they're good people, they're nice people, I assure
but
you.
I think that what matters here a lot is incentives.
Exactly.
So when I came to Washington as a youngling, and a good libertarian, I wanted to believe that politicians were just dumb.
Yeah.
But then I started meeting them, and I realized that they are very smart people.
Sure.
And in many instances, highly read people. So intelligent as well informed.
Yeah.
So I sort of started asking myself, what explains this disaster, which is the federal government? And there must be some set of incentives which drive these people toward, completely ignoring fiscal responsibility and things like that. Just like, say, at a DMV, you don't have to smile at your customer. You don't have to be nice to your customer because you know that you are unfireable.
Yeah.
The corollary of that, the other set of incentives for politicians is that so long as they give the populace exactly what it wants, no matter how harmful in the long run, they will get re-elected.
Well, yeah, and I agree with that. There's a line and an excellent body of research in economics called public choice, which inquires seriously into how governments actually behave. And as you point out, there are massive incentives, which we actually know about as ordinary people. We know that the politicians want to get reelected, and we know that they're exaggerating how easily they can fix, the economy. But I think there's something else, which is ideology, sincere convictions. So although I'm an economist and I know about incentives, and yeah, you're right, there's also faith. There's not just the virtue of prudence, but there's the virtue, or in this case, sometimes vice, of faith. And so people sincerely believe in, that they can arrange your life. There was a very amusing example in Sweden, must have been about 8 or 10 years ago, where literally the government came out with a report on how much toothpaste you should put on your toothbrush. And some fool in the government decided that would be a good idea and recommended 2 centimeters. I mean, come on. Give over, as the kids say. this is insane. And that kind of, but undoubtedly this person was sincerely desirous of helping the ordinary citizens. See, the problem is the analogy with the family. When you're a mother, you teach your child how much toothpaste to put on. And there's a very powerful thought in many people's minds that our society, our polity, our economy should also be a family. And that Mama and Papa will tell us what to do. And it's so another word for this kind of liberalism, I always stutter on the word liberal, it's irritating, would be adultism. That instead of treating people as, stupid, you treat them as adults. And again, this matter, adults working within a spontaneous order, this thing in between the government, the rules, the laws, which we need the laws, and the action that I'm going to eat another spoonful of ice cream, which is my individual choice. There's a spontaneous order.
Let's remain on this subject for a while.
Yeah, let's do
it. One of the points that I've heard you make before is about this difference between the family on the one hand and a broader society, national economy, perhaps even global economy as a whole.
Right.
So Hayek talks about the micro world and the macro world. The micro world is the family, where the relationships between people are not run according to the rules of the marketplace.
You don't send out your 6-year-old son to work to pay for lunch that you're going to provide for.
That's right. So it's not a strict quid pro quo.
In fact, it's socialism.
In fact,
it's from each according to her ability, to each according to his need. And it's lovely and appropriate and good for children.
And for family. Now, so why can it not be scaled to the global economy? The issue here is that if we still had an economy the size of a family, the Greeks have a word for it, oikonomia, it's really just household economy.
Right.
If we still had the economy the size of a family, we would be incredibly poor. The reason why we are super rich today by historical standards is because we have a global economy where billions of people specialize.
Yeah.
But the rules of the global economy, the macro world that Hayek talks about, are very different from the rules of the economy in the micro world, which is the family. So why cannot it be scaled?
It can't be scaled because of the usual things that economists talk about, free rider problems. St. Paul said to a group of early Christians whom he had visited, I've been told that you, in anticipation of the second coming of Christ, have stopped working. He who does not work shall not eat, said St. Paul. And that's the problem of free riding. Oh, well, there'll be enough food because he and she, they're working, and I'm just going to pray or just wait for Jesus to show up tomorrow. Why should I work? And so there's that. And then there are impersonal arm's length rules of exchange, which are not how we run households. We run households on love and prudence, but in the larger society, it has to be justice and prudence. You've got to have rules that you got to pay your debts, and You can't just walk away from your responsibilities. That word responsibility functions both in the family and in the society as a whole, but they're not the same responsibilities. Now look, I don't want to carry this too far, because I think we do have a responsibility of love to other people. I'm a Christian liberal. I could be a Muslim liberal or a Hindu and have the same opinion, namely that we owe the handicapped and the oppressed help. We owe the Ukrainians protection against an invasion by their neighbor. So there's a cosmopolitanism which is characteristic of the modern world, where we care about the Uyghurs oppressed in China. So it's not just self-interest and incentives and markets. And there's one more point. The larger society, the larger the market is, the more global we are, the more innovations we get. As the society enriches, more people go to engineering school, and more people can get a little money to start a little business. Whole Foods started with one store in Austin. McDonald's started with a little chain of restaurants in California. And so innovation is really, it's true that specialization, exchange is crucial. Actually, St. Paul had something to say on that too. In 1 Corinthians 12, he talks about the variety of gifts that people have, with the implication that we should use our gifts to help each other. And we do, if we have market incentives and the rule of law, and are not engaged in a big civil war. But there's also the release of creativity in a free society. So it would be possible for a strictly centrally planned economy worldwide. Suppose we were all communists, everyone in the world. As you know from your personal experience, recently about a quarter to a third of the world was communist. That could do the exchanges quite efficiently. It could operate on an arm's length rule of law so far as specialization was concerned. It didn't actually, but it could. But the creativity of free adults is what's evoked, called out in liberalism.
And for innovation, you need a good deal of economic freedom.
You need a great deal of economic freedom.
One reason why perhaps we shouldn't be as worried about China in the long run as we are is precisely because it is a society where the freedom to speak, think, exchange ideas, publish ideas, critique ideas is heavily constricted.
Exactly.
But let me focus on this distinction between trade and exchange and innovation. I read maybe in your friend's Joel Mokier's work about the difference between what he called the Smithian growth and the Schumpeterian growth. The Smithian growth being based on specialization and exchange.
That's right.
Whereas the Schumpeterian growth is based on innovation and creative destruction.
That's right.
Can we explore these ideas a little more? And then first of all, do you agree that fundamentally the Schumpeterian growth brings about much higher rates of economic growth, and practically all of modern society is based on it?
Yes.
And could you elaborate on those two?
Well, look, if I exchange with you, and that's what we do. You have a Coke, I have a bottle of water, and you need, not need, let's not use the word need, but we make an agreement to exchange. We're both made better off, a little bit. And then if we do this in the world, we're made a lot better off by the United States specializing in making agricultural machinery, and Ukraine specializing in growing the wheat that uses the agricultural machinery. So that's nice. But you can show in economics that is limited. At least if we don't contrast, well, I don't want to get too fancy here, but extensions of trade are good, but they're not really, really good. Whereas, I said before, the change since 1800 or so in our ways of doing things, which is what we mean by innovation, has been so enormous that we're 20, 30, 100 times better off.
Right. The analogy would be something like saying that, let's say United States produced shovels and Ukraine produced wheat. We could trade and everybody would be better off. But if the United States can produce tractors, which is an innovation, then you are taking it to a whole new different level.
And indeed, on the wheat side, if wheat is grown with modern biology, it's better wheat. It just is. And so those, that's right. On both sides, the new stuff and the new stuff is all around us, and it's not just the technology, although it's very importantly the technology. Weaving machines that can make enormous carpets. This thing is very, very big. Those were invented in the 18th and early 19th century. The first use of computers, in a sense, card computers with cards, punch cards, was to make rugs in Britain and then in Belgium. So there's that, but there's also the individual innovation that little people make that are not fancy technologies, that nonetheless, if allowed to happen, immensely improve our lives. I decide to start a hairdressing salon, which I need, I admit, in the neighborhood, or I move to the United States from Norway, as some of my ancestors, or Ireland, as my ancestors did. Those moves are in some ways trade-like exchange, but they can be epic-making. Particularly if, the small move like starting Walmart in Arkansas with one store, if that turns out to be a really good idea, other people imitate it, and you get this immense change in marketing, in retail, that Walmart by itself has caused in the world. So I'm not elevating technologists and scientists, as Joe Mokyr, that wonderful historian that you mentioned, who's a very dear friend of mine, he tends to emphasize that too much, and not enough the liberty part.
Liberty part and the little people, which takes me back to where we started, about the whole business with grade enrichment and hierarchy.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit. We had the egalitarian past, which was the hunter-gathering past. Then comes agriculture. Societies become very hierarchical.
And note that it's the agricultural revolution, a good thing, which resulted in big cities, therefore in people learning to read and inventing reading. Yeah.
But it creates hierarchy, and it creates a certain level of social stagnation. In fact, a serious social stagnation. Whereas if you are born to a family of Smiths, you are probably going to be a Smith, and your children are going to be a Smith for generations. When a young person in Western, liberal, industrial, educated, rich society looks at the society today, they still see a lot of hierarchy which they resent. You know, rich kids from rich parents going to better schools, and things like that. What would Deirdre McCloskey say to those children vis-a-vis, compare it to the life before, say, 1600 or before 1700? We are not perfect, right?
Right. Well, here's the problem. We're reinventing the life before 1600 in statism. Statism is the real opposite of liberalism, as you and I are talking about it. It's this notion that our betters, our masters, know what's good for us, or indeed what's bad for us. But anyway, they're in charge. And that's the tendency of the modern world, to increase the size of the government. In France, 55% of what French people produce is seized by the government for the government's purposes. Now, sometimes the government's purposes are just what people would want to have anyway, higher education and sanitation and blah, blah, blah. But it's a very imperfect way of choosing what people want. A much better way would be to just let them keep their money and then they decide what they want. But you're right. Things are better than they were in Shakespeare's time. In this very sense that people have, now here's the key phrase. In liberalism, invented in the 18th century, people are to have equality of permission, not equality of outcome. So envy is not to be the basis for social policy. Not even equality of opportunity, which sounds, if it could be achieved costlessly, I'd want there to be equality of opportunity. But here's the trouble with that phrase, equality of opportunity, as against equality of permission, where we stop making statist laws that you can't be a plumber because the plumbers union is in charge, or you can't buy drugs from Canada because the government has told you that it can't. So Americans pay 5 times more for drugs than the Canadians do. That's equality of permission, to take away all this underbrush of you can't do that, I'm going to tell you what to do. You can't. But equality of opportunity is impossible.
Because we differ in our innate
Because, as
talents.
St. Paul said, we have a variety of gifts. And I make the joke that I chose my parents extremely carefully and wisely, and I deserve full credit. And if my income is higher than yours because my parents were a professor at Harvard and an opera singer, I deserve it. Now, that's obviously crazy. I didn't choose my parents. So let's see. How are we going to make my opportunities and that of some kid who grew up with bad parents equal? Well, let's take away my good parents, and the state can force parents to behave badly. Or it can try to get everyone to behave as well as a professor at Harvard and opera singer in bringing up their child, which is, you can see it's impossible. It just can't be done. Now, by the way, I think there is a state interest in preventing abuse of children, but
people who cannot help themselves. You already mentioned children, maybe the infirm.
That's right. But even so, a certain amount of intervention into ordinary families, not ordinary families, the pathologies of chaining up your child in the basement and feeding her on bread and water for 10 years, that I'm against, and I want the police to go in and stop it. But to achieve equality of opportunity is basically impossible.
So let's just sum this up.
Whereas, but observe, equality of permission is possible.
Yeah.
It's not remote, it's very easy to do. Just stop bossing people around.
Because everybody deserves the same dignity of being treated equally before the law.
Exactly. It's the dignity of equality before the law being the state. Because the law is coercive. It should be. We should, if someone breaks into your house and steals all your stuff, I don't mind having the cops come and grab that person and put him in jail. That's fine.
Let me try to make a sort of broader point out of these different equalities.
Yeah.
And let's see if you agree with that.
Yeah.
So the great innovation of the 18th century is equality before the law.
Yep.
The idea being that if you're a member of the clergy or the member of the aristocracy, you still have to pay your taxes.
That's right.
Which previously you perhaps didn't have to.
Yeah, in France you were exempted if you were in the nobility, exempted from taxes.
And most people in the world accept that equality before the law is a good thing. There may be some outliers, but generally that is
or at least they claim they do.
Yeah, that's the accepted floor.
Yeah.
Then in this country, in the United States, people talk a lot about equality of opportunity, how important it is.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that it is impossible.
Yeah.
I love tennis. I've been playing tennis since I was the age of 5, but I will never have a crack at winning Wimbledon because I don't have the talents of Roger Federer or Rafael Nadal.
Right.
So because of these different qualities that people bring to the table, equality of opportunity is unachievable. And then you take it a step further, which is the equality of outcome. And there's that small matter of 100 million people who have died last century trying to create equality of outcome. And I think that the broader point I'm trying to make is that I think that because we think of equality as being something good, we are always searching or trying to improve on that equality, build on it. But it doesn't work like that, does it? The history of ideas or ideas themselves don't work like that. Sometimes you do reach a peak of sort of societal achievement with equality before the law. And when you start moving beyond that, you're causing more harm than good.
Yeah,
do you agree with that?
Look, sure. Sure I do. In science, mathematics, let's take mathematics. Newton was smarter than other people and therefore was able to achieve, there's a debate about it, also Leibniz was smarter than other people. And they were able to achieve the invention of calculus. Well, great. I'm all for it. And then everyone's better off if we allow a certain inequality to express itself.
For the genius to rise to the top.
For the genius to rise to the top. The great football player, we voluntarily pay to watch him do the what's it called? The turn. This guy who played for Barcelona a long time. Anyway, I don't understand soccer very well, but so excellence, even if it comes from inherited good parents, is something we want to encourage in the world. And then that's okay. If we're envious and insist, no, we're going to have equality, as you said, it's been tried out. A kind of equality, although even under Soviet communism, things weren't equal.
Well, oddly enough, by aiming at equality of outcome, they have actually undermined equality before the law, where the society was presided over by almost a feudal class of people who were exempted.
That's an excellent point, which I haven't quite thought of before. In order to achieve equality of outcome, as against this equality of permission, which is letting people alone, you have to have such a powerful state that equality before the law is temptingly attacked. the vision of Lenin in the Soviet Union was of equality. In fact, come to think of it, the three Soviet constitutions in their history, there's one in the 20s, one in the 30s, and one I think in the 1970s. They're beautiful documents because they say we're going to be equal, and of course we're going to obey the law. We're never going to invade your house and drag you out for jail. Free press, they all say it. We're going to have a free press, and it's going to be beautiful. And as you just articulated, the problem is that a state powerful enough to do that by compulsion, which is what states do, they have to. State says, as Max Weber said, is defined as a monopoly of violence and should be. A state powerful enough to do that is a wonderful instrument for stealing from people. Is a wonderful instrument for having. It's said, it's true, that in the Gulag, in the system of work camps, jails, prisons in the Soviet Union, there were stratifications according to your status in the Communist Party. If you were a commissar and you made a mistake, according to the top commissar, you were sent to a fancier gulag than someone who was just a worker. A spectacular example of this is Putin's Russia, which started as a free economy and has become increasingly a kleptocracy. The richest person in the world is not Jeff Bezos. The richest person in the world is Putin.
Having stolen something like $1 trillion over his 20 years in power.
That's right.
So the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because I think that a lot of young people especially are looking at the society today and they see all of these imperfections and they are dreaming up societies that would have perfect social mobility and would have none of these imperfections that we talked about. But that's not really how it is. Liberalism does not promise perfection because perfection is unattainable in this world.
That's right. Another person associated with Cato, the great political scientist at Ohio State, John Mueller, has an excellent book in 1999 called Capitalism and Socialism and Ralph's Pretty Good Grocery. Now, I wish John hadn't made that joke in the title because no one understands what it means. But here's the theme. He says, look, democracy as it functions, say, in the United States, is pretty good. I mean, there are things you can do, little things. If we got rid of the primary system for choosing candidates, that would improve it a bit. And if we did this and we did that. But it works pretty well. So does capitalism, although I don't even like the word capitalism. But so does capitalism. It works pretty well. If you try to go across town to the absolute perfection store, it hasn't worked. And it keeps not working. The theocracy in Iran isn't, or in Saudi Arabia, is not good for the people of those countries. The Soviet communism was a real disaster. Mao, extreme central planning and communism under Mao in China, left the Chinese at $2 a day. And when they adopted equality of permission in the economy, not in politics, but in the economy, China went from $2 a day to $45 a day.
One point which I always make when talking about human progress is that human progress measures today relative to yesterday.
Yes.
It does not concern itself with a utopia, which
that's
comes
right.
from Greek utopos, which means no country, meaning
That's
it's
right.
not a place.
That's right.
It's utopianism is an idea
Yeah.
of a perfect society which
Yeah.
cannot be accomplished on this
And,
earth. But
we've been obsessed with utopias for all of recorded human history. We keep trying to achieve them. And in the modern world, with a lot of educated people, they keep thinking up new utopias. Let's make money ice cream, so it'll melt, and then we'll have to make more money. I mean, any economics professor gets letters all the time for people with suggestions of achieving utopia. People who know nothing about economics or history will come up with these things more or less endlessly, and they don't work. That's John Mueller's point, that it's pretty good. Don't mess with it too much. I mean, this was again Adam Smith's point, that you make adjustments. He's not against progress. He's not against changing laws a little bit. But this kind of thing that happened in the French Revolution, about the time that Adam Smith died, was attempting to achieve utopia.
the way I think about the difference between, say, conservatism, liberalism, and progressivism
Yeah.
is that conservatives sort of look at the current state of society and say, this is the best that we can hope for. Let us sort of freeze it in time. Or they look at the 1950s and say, this was the best time and we need to go back to it. But the point is that it is not open to innovation.
Exactly.
Progressivism, on the other side of the political spectrum,
Yep.
basically says everything in society is rotten.
Yep.
Therefore, let's burn it down,
Yep.
and then we are somehow going to figure out a perfect society, and then sprinkling of magic dust, and voila, you are in utopia.
Both these are afraid of the future. The conservatives are afraid of the future because it's not like the past. The progressives are afraid of the future because they don't want it to be, they want it to be this way instead of that way, and they know what it should be. Whereas liberals, they're not kind of in the middle. People talk that way, but they're not really in the middle. They have an optimistic, generous faith in the future. That's not going to be perfect, but if we have free adults running around innovating, we're going to do pretty well. And how do we know that? Because it's happened in the last couple of centuries. When it was tried, liberalism worked. When either conservatism or progressivism has been thoroughly tried, it hasn't worked.
I would only add to that functionally, liberalism offers a way out of the sort of conservative stagnation without getting too drunk on a utopian future.
That's
we
an
believe
excellent way of expressing
in
it.
taking the rules as we find them,
Yeah.
figuring out what works, what doesn't, and the things that doesn't get adjusted over time
Yeah.
until we end up in a country where black people are no longer enslaved, women have a vote, gays can marry, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But that's a different proposition from saying, let's start anew, year zero.
Yeah. In fact, that's of course what they said in the French Revolution. They said it was year zero.
So liberals keep a sense of appreciation of the rules as they find them. We sort of assume that the rules are there for a reason before we change them, no?
But yes, they absolutely do. But it's not the rules. It's not the institutions. It's the spontaneous orders in the middle that we respect and the others don't. And the spontaneous orders are the result of free adults interacting. My friend Howard, the great sociologist, Howard Becker, not my colleague Gary Becker, the economist, but the sociologist, speaks of worlds where people are sort of negotiating with each other and making trades and so on. And I don't think Howie understands that it's liberal economics that he's talking about, but that's what it is. And it's not just the rule of law. I mean, conservatives talk about the rule of law, and they often mean laws like the American income tax system that are good for them. And I say that's spinach, and I say to hell with it. It's the worlds, as Howie would say, in which we allow each other to try out things in this optimistic way that liberals have.
So the world is stagnant and highly stratified, hierarchized until relatively recently.
Yeah.
We refer to ourselves as moderns.
Yeah.
Because something happened circa 1750
Oh,
or so,
I did it.
which changes the society beyond all recognition. I like to say that if you are born 4000 BC in ancient Egypt, you will feel just right at home in ancient Rome, or 1000 AD during the Norman conquest.
I
Your
completely
life hasn't
agree.
changed.
No.
But if you
You're
are
right.
born in 1500 and then you re-enter the world, somehow you get transported via a time machine to 1900,
Yeah.
it's completely different.
It is.
What happens?
Well, what happened is an ideological change in northwestern Europe, starting in Holland in the 16th and 17th century, but really coming to maturity in Britain, that is England and Scotland, in the 18th century, at least as an idea, the Englishman's freedoms. But, gradually expressed, because the only people who could vote were people with substantial property, and many of them couldn't vote. So in Britain, and then in the United States, the same thing. All men and women, dear, are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was written by a slave owner. So it's highly imperfect. And then you gradually enfranchise, so to speak, more and more people. We finally overturned Jim Crow in the South, the inability of blacks to vote or to... The other day, a United States senator named Brown from Indiana advocated states' rights in laws against interracial marriage, which we had until a Supreme Court decision in 1967 overturned laws such as that of Virginia that blacks and whites couldn't marry. So this is conservatism gone completely off the rails. When you want to get back to the the world of the 1950s, even in matters of interracial marriage or the treatment of gays or
Well, good luck to him. He's not going to make it very far, is he?
I hope he gets thrown out of office in the next possible election.
But, a lot of kids leaving colleges or even high schools in America today will say, Deirdre, why did it take 150 years?
Yeah, that's right.
Why did it take so long before women got a vote?
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean that the whole system, the constitution, what this country was built on, is all wrong because it wasn't born perfect, like Athena, fully armed, springing out of Zeus's loin, was it?
Yes, his
Something
loins,
like that.
and then on the shell, Venus on the half shell, we say. Yeah, that's right. And I once felt this way.
You did?
Oh, absolutely. When I was a young person, I was a socialist. I'm In 1959, I thought revolution was a great idea. There's a kind of romance to it, of course. We will build the world again, said Thomas Paine. We have the power to build the world again. Now, I admired Tom Paine. He was he was a liberal in most ways. But this idea of this romantic, and I say that in a more or less precise way, the romantic movement in Germany, which then spread to the rest of Europe, emphasized the power of the artist, elevated the artist to the status of a Superman. And it's that caused the proliferation of utopias in the modern world. This idea that one man, Lenin, or Mao, or I don't know, Hitler, can make a society as though it were a work of art, as though it were a sculpture.
One might say even clay. That can
Clay
be
indeed, clay indeed. We have the government, I'm in charge of it, I'm the Führer, I'm Mussolini. I remake the society. And that's where the attraction comes. It's like rock music or something. It's this creation that excites you. And the problem that liberalism has is that it's boring. There's a Swiss-English writer who speaks of his hometown of Zurich as being boringly bourgeois. But he admires that. He says, look, people are doing very well in Zurich, not because of top-down Swiss bureaucracy, but because they're free and bourgeois. But, you know, when you're 18, your dad is this boring guy who goes to the office, and your mom goes to the office too in the modern world, and they're stupid. It's sort of like the attitude that people develop, intelligent, bright kids at age 14, are very likely to become atheists. They're raised in the Anglican church or the Baptist church or something, and they say, oh, that's stupid. My stupid teachers and parents, they believe all that stuff. I don't believe in God. To hell with it. And the same is true of the boring stuff that they don't understand. Because what they don't understand is the spontaneous order in the middle. They don't understand the way art, science, friendship, language, the economy actually operates. They have no understanding of it.
The other thing that puzzles me about the criticism of liberalism, that it hasn't come already perfect, that it took a long time. Well, let's talk about long time. What is a long time? We as Anthropocene, we've been around for about 7 million years.
Right.
As Homo sapiens, we've been around between 200 or 300,000 years. The agricultural revolution begins anywhere between 10 and 12,000 years.
Yeah.
Then it's the age of empires and slavery and conquest and genocide and that sort of thing. And liberalism emerges 200 years ago.
Yep.
Changes the world.
Yep.
And yet somehow people still feel like we have moved too slowly. On one level, we have moved too slowly. I wish we had all of these liberal policies toward women, sexual minorities, and so on much earlier. However, on what planet would you expect a new idea which promises to completely rework the entire society and how individual human beings see each other to be adopted immediately in its complete form by absolutely everyone.
That's an excellent point, and it's true. I mean, I'm a historian as well as an economist. I'm fond of saying, I love dead people. The more dead, the better. And you're absolutely right. On the scale of even agricultural society, which, as you say, 8 or 10,000 years ago in 9 different parts of the world was invented. It's a moment. I mean, we talk in economic history of the hockey stick, not a field hockey stick that bends back, but an ice hockey stick. This thrills Czech men and Swedish men and Canadian men. They all get excited if you talk about hockey sticks. And here it is. You start 300,000 BC with Homo sapiens and goes along at $2 a day, $2 a day, $2 a day. Well, about here you invent agriculture, goes up a bit, whoop, then it goes back to $2 a day, because that's the Malthusian pressure of population. And then it comes up to here. Malthus writes his book in 1798 that says, oh, we're fated. It's hopeless. Look at all the $2 a day. There's nothing going to happen. Almost at the moment that Malthus writes that population is really a big problem, it goes like this: income per head and other things than income per head, music, art, science, goes like this. It's very, very important to have the sound effect. And it goes,
the camera, I got it.
It just completely explodes the world, as you say, in this tiny little period, way at the end. And then people say, oh, well, it's not perfect. Let's get something perfect here. It's like a marriage.
I wouldn't know, but do tell.
Well, your partner, whether a man or a woman. I was married for 30 years. My marriage wasn't perfect, but very good. And, you know, we have to have a perfect marriage, or we're gonna, as you say, burn down the institution of marriage. Although my heroine, Mae West, a great vaudeville and movie comedian of the 20s and 30s, she wrote her own stuff, and she had this line: I'm in favor of the institution of marriage, but I'm not ready for an institution, which turns on the vocabulary in English where institution means a madhouse.
That's right. Being institutionalized.
That's right, being institutionalized. So perfection is not attainable. And if we pursue it.
Okay, then what is to be done, to quote Lenin? I mean, there is an undoubted anger and dissatisfaction with the liberal society as we have, as it has evolved over the last 200 years. Really, I think that the only way that today can be measured is by looking into the past. That means studying history. And I don't see much hunger amongst young people for history.
No.
We cannot force them to learn history.
Well, I try to, but it doesn't work. I have taught 430 undergraduates at a time in a single class. The second half, we called it, of Western civilization, 1648 to the present. And it's a performance. The only way you can get them to pay attention is to make it a show. Yeah, the old line, if those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it, and you and I agree that we don't want to repeat the crimes of the past. History is like foreign travel. the past, it's been said, is a foreign country. And your personal experience in your life of moving from country to country, mine of travel from country to country, gives a perspective. And we both admire the longer perspective that you get from history. But you can teach the history in ways that even young people don't find boring. With his historical drama. But then the problem is that the artists are mainly socialists. The artists are not, for the most part, admirers of this liberal
it's very difficult to
opportunity.
come up with thinking about a Hollywood movie which is about an inventor or innovator.
There are only a few. There are some. The Founder, with Michael Keaton playing Ray Kroc, making McDonald's into what it was. Or Joy, about Joy Mangano, the inventor of the self-squeezing mop. Honestly, about the same time as...
And there's also a good movie about Alan Turing and his sort of initial work on
That's
computing,
right. That's
although
right.
they emphasized his sexual orientation rather than
Yeah.
his mathematical
Yeah, that's right.
genius. I understand that, but it does seem to me that history does play a very important role here, and we need to find a better way of teaching people about history.
What we need to do is to get the artists on our side. The artists were once great exponents of liberalism. Beethoven changed the name of a symphony in aid of a free society.
The story being it was number 5.
Yep. And he was admiring Napoleon. And when he realized that Napoleon was a bloodthirsty tyrant, as he undoubtedly was, he changed his mind. Now look, he didn't just change his mind, he changed his symphony. and Ode to Joy became, come on, this is great stuff. And it inspires people to become free adults. We have this way of thinking about politics that we can't get out of, which is left. I'll do it as though, anyway, left and right. And the events in Ukraine, we're speaking now in March of 2022, have an opportunity to switch the axis, to get ordinary people who don't pay a lot of attention to political theory or even politics to see that the big choice is between tyranny and freedom. Putin's invasion of Ukraine contrasts two countries. One is a tyranny, one is not. And I think the worldwide revulsion against Putin's action is a promising sign that when it's made clear to them through historical study or travel or rock music or whatever, what the difference between freedom and tyranny is, they prefer freedom. Now, not everyone wants to be an adult. As I said, you could call the cause of freedom adultism. Some people prefer to be children forever and have mama and papa make all the decisions. In fact, Putin in his reign of over 20 years has been very successful in teaching the Russian people to go back to having a czar. So there's got to be a kind of re-education of that sad country.
What happened in art? You say that artists used to be liberal, classical liberal.
They did. I mean, in the early 19th century, they virtually all were. I mean, there were some exceptions, and actually, Romanticism had versions that were conservative, but in a kind of liberal way. I mean, it was nice.
Right, and this would go with the artistic sort of character, is that you are rebelling against the stultifying power of the church, of the nobility.
But, you know, that's
hierarchy.
very, very modern. And that's liberalism against the old hierarchies. Dutch art in the 17th century, in the so-called Golden Age, was not against the old hierarchies. Raphael was not against the old hierarchies. They were hired by the old hierarchies. The church and the state paid them to paint propaganda in favor of monarchy, say. It's only in the 19th century, and really, yeah, in the early 19th century, the Romantic movement in, say, painting glorifies rebelling, as you just said, against the old hierarchies. And by the late 19th century, and someone like Van Gogh, or as we Dutch call it, Van Gogh, if you can
Such a
say
lovely
that.
language.
It's a lovely language. It's against, it starts to be against everything. And then in the 20th century, there are many artists, Picasso being an example, who are simply nihilists against the wonderfully generous and art of Matisse.
So is this something that we are stuck with forever, given that United States is, broadly speaking, a free market economy? Well, I would call it a mixed economy, but whatever. As a general rule, market mechanism is still allowed to perform its functions relatively freely. And
even in Sweden, by the way.
Even in Sweden. And because that is the dominant, by no means, it is a dominant system of economic relations. And given that artists are sort of always, they desire to create art against the big guy, what they perceive to be the big guy, the dominant force.
At least modern artists do.
Modern artists, yeah, that's what I meant. Is it because they are on this constant, are in this constant struggle against the big guy, the dominant force in society, that they are bound to be socialists forever? As long as capitalism is here, then the artists will try to take it down, as opposed to in communist days, when I remember that communism was here and the artists were trying to undermine it from the bottom, because it was the artists under communism which destroyed the system from within. So is it structural? In other words, it's unavoidable.
Well, you know, the modern artist, the modern rebellious artist, which you see in French, beginning in French Impressionism, for example, and then getting more and more like that. When you ask modern artists what they're doing, they're saying, we're criticizing society. And I always get really annoyed by that, because they don't know anything about society. I mean, what is a painter? Is a painter an economist and historian and political scientist and philosopher? No, she's a painter. And maybe it would be better if they stuck to their last, as we say. But it's a deep problem. Look, when people are intelligent and free, they're free to criticize. Whereas until very late, denying the divinity of Christ in England, the home of our liberties, was a capital offense. And so there's a deep paradox, or you might say a political problem in liberalism, that we liberals believe that people should be allowed to say anything they want. And even if it's offensive to other people. And that means that people start chattering offensively. Tucker Carlson on TV supports Putin. We say, Tucker, stop it. But we allow him to do it. And this kind of nihilism that comes that I said in Picasso and lots of other modern artists is corrosive. Whereas if you have a fixed ideology, not fixed idea, that's not quite the word, but an orthodoxy that must not be tampered with, as in communism or in old theocracies and so on, then there is no corrosion until the liberal idea arises.
Yeah, you said it's a problem, and I agree with you. But of course, one of the great insights of liberalism is that not all problems have a solution.
That's
we
right.
don't really know how to address the problem of artistic iconoclasm.
You're right.
Maybe that's just one of those things that will persist until some other problem, in their view, in their eyes, becomes even more serious, that they have to focus their artistic energies on that. But there is one more question that I'm meant to ask you. I mean, England and Western Europe comes up constantly in your work as the birthplace of liberalism.
Yes.
And I totally agree that in these 3 massive volumes, which I'm happy to say I read.
These are my babies.
Those are your babies. One of your 24 books, but these 3 are the trilogy that I dare say made you famous. You do show that liberalism takes off, these liberal ideas, permissionless society, letting people to have a go, happens over the last 200 years. But the question that I always meant to ask you is, why is it 200, 250 years ago? Why is the 18th century? Why is it Western Europe that begins to take the foot off the neck of the ordinary person?
That's you're referring to the terrifying vision in George Orwell's 1984, where the party man O'Brien explains to the hero of the book, if you want a vision of the future, think of a boot on a human face forever. And that's the ultimate end, I think, or what's going to happen, what might happen under thoroughgoing statism, whether conservative or progressive. Well, it happened in England and in Western Europe, as you say, by what I would say are accidents. It's not that there's something deeply liberal about, say, Christianity. For centuries, 17 centuries, Christianity was not a liberal force. In fact, in particular, Roman Catholic Christianity was a monarchy, an absolute monarchy within the limits of the secular power of the Pope. And nor is there something about melanin-challenged individuals like you and me, who, when our ancestors came out of Africa, turned left and got into cold places. Is there something special about Europeans? it's simply not the case that there's a depth of the liberal idea in European civilization that's somehow distinct from other civilizations. There are liberal ideas in Islam, for example, that our colleague here at Cato is trying to encourage. And there are liberal ideas in Japan pretty much suppressed under the Tokugawa shogunate, and under the Song dynasty in China, there were liberal ideas in the economy flourishing 1,000 years ago. So it's not that we're Europeans and we're better than everyone else and we're going to show you how to be liberal. As you said earlier, you might even think of it as a genetic disposition to liberty in human beings, conditioned by our extremely long experience with hunter-gatherer bands, which are liberal. We tend to think of them as having a chieftain, but that's a later development. Most of these hunter-gatherer bands were very, very small, and you could easily walk away from them. All right, so I've lost track.
No, that's quite right. It seems to me that what you are saying is that the agricultural revolution, with its hierarchical societies and social immobility, is a bit of an interlude. And I think what you are implying is that liberalism, starting 200 years ago in Western Europe and persisting to today, is really an attempt to reconnect with those freedom-loving, egalitarian, under the law, ideas of the hunter-gatherers, or rather, maybe that's too far. Maybe saying something like anti-status and anti-hierarchical ideas of hunter-gatherers.
You don't have a master in a small hunter-gatherer band. Whereas in agriculture, there's the lord, he has a sword and a horse, and you're fixed there because you depend on your crop, and your crop just sits there. And so some guy comes with a sword and a horse and says, "So sorry, this is my land now. Too bad for you." So that's where the hierarchy comes from. Also the hierarchy of priesthood, which is very ancient. And so those hierarchies are challenged in liberalism. Francis Fukuyama claimed famously that liberal democracy is the end of history. And I think Frank's right. This slow development, or to go back to your question, why England? Why Western Europe? This slow accidental development, where certain accidents since 1517, to be precise, accidentally produced a liberal England. England was not liberal under Henry VIII, believe it, or under Elizabeth I or James and Charles. It was illiberal. Why did this liberal idea arise in what people call the Anglosphere in the 18th century? And the reason is, for example, that the Protestant Reformation was not crushed by Rome. And in particular, the radical Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptists, and eventually in England, the Quakers, who didn't have any hierarchy at all in church governance, unlike my Anglicanism, they gave people the idea that you can be free in your religious life, entirely new idea. So maybe we can be free in other parts of our life. Again, if the Spanish Armada in 1588 had been able to land the best army in Europe by far, the Spanish army, on the south coast of England, England might have been forced back under the Roman Church. Holland would have been much more isolated than it was, and maybe the Counter-Reformation would have comprehensively won, in which case liberalism would have been long delayed in Europe. And so it went. A series of accidents, which I talk about in the third volume of the trilogy, happened to make this highly illiberal society, England, into a nascent liberalism.
How important was interjurisdictional competition in allowing liberal ideas to survive? The point made by Stephen Davis from Institute of Economic Affairs in London is that everywhere else in the world you have empires.
That's right.
And China, Ottoman Empire. And what empires are primarily interested in is domestic security, stability.
Right.
They are not worried about being attacked from the outside because they are too large to
too
be
big.
consumed by anybody else.
Right.
So what they're primarily concerned about is domestic opposition. And whenever somebody starts saying something they don't like, just heads get chopped off.
Steve is absolutely right in his, he has a marvelous book.
Europe was different though. Europe was different in the sense that it didn't have an empire.
Exactly.
Internally.
It didn't. Now there were attempts. Charlemagne did a fairly good job of gathering together large parts of Europe, but his sons split it up into three parts, and then it kept splitting and splitting and splitting. Germany, the German lands, even after 1648, had hundreds of polities. The bishops, in many states, free states in the empire being Austrian or Austrian Spanish, Habsburg, states like Prussia, which is said most states have an army. In Prussia, the army had the state. And even unified polities like France or England, it was easy to escape from them. So when John Locke was under threat from James II, who wanted to make Britain, England at that time, back into a Catholic nation, was under threat, he could flee to Holland, and did, and was greatly influenced by Dutch ideas. Holland itself was a collection of towns that competed with each other even. And so this competitive environment was a good thing. Now, it's easy to exaggerate the efficacy of empire. The Roman Empire, for example, people think, well, everything was decided in Rome. Not really. The state capacity, as we say in modern terminology, of Rome or China or the empires of India or the Ottoman Empire was somewhat limited. So local autonomy could happen. But I think Steve is absolutely correct to emphasize the astonishing lack of unity in Europe. And look, Charlemagne, Napoleon, Hitler, and for that matter, Stalin, all tried to unify Europe. The Pope in the investiture controversy tried to do the same.
Louis XIV, Charles V, they all tried to create.
Louis XIV, Charles V, you're right. They all kept trying and they failed.
And the point being is that when you are a small country and you are at all times at risk of being subsumed by somebody else, you've got to start allowing greater degree of liberalism within your own country, because it leads to greater growth and innovation and so forth, and that allows you to also defend yourself against the predator.
That's right. And this happened over and over again. Certainly it's the English case, but it's also the case of the Italian city-states in northern Italy. But there's always a choice. You can either try to enforce, say, censorship, as the French state tried to do all the time, or the French in the 18th century were enforcing protectionism for wool cloth by executing people who imported calico cloth.
It's astonishing.
Or sending them to the galleys in the Mediterranean for a term of 15 years. So they kept trying to do it.
To have unified government control.
That's
over
right.
France. I mean, I only recently learned that France didn't have a single market within France until the revolution.
That's false.
That's false?
That's completely false. Well, it depends what you mean by a single market. If you mean that there were laws that obstructed the movement of grain, yeah, that's true. They did.
That's what I meant, yeah.
But nonetheless, the prices, the economic outcome, because there is enough leakage in all this, made for a unified national market in grain. So it's easy to exaggerate how much the laws could constrain the economy of France. But still, as that great liberal Alexis de Tocqueville said in his book on the Ancien regime and the French Revolution, he was contrasting France with Britain and making the point that the French kept doing these statist stupidities like exempting nobles from taxes. Of course, there was a vigorous market in buying nobilities from the state, from the king, so the nobility gradually expanded, because boy, if you could be exempted from taxes, wouldn't that be wonderful?
It almost seems to me like the sort of broad scope of history that emerges from this discussion is that when we were hunter-gatherers, we had freedom, but we had nothing. We were dirt poor. Agricultural revolution, you're relatively well off. Well, you're certainly better off. But you lose your freedom.
No, you're not. You're not better off. You're originally better off, but then Malthusian pressures drive you back to $2 a day. But the side benefit, of course, of the Toltecs in Central America and the Chinese and the South Asians and the this and the that inventing writing, and by the way, place value for numbers, is that you get this, how can I say, this machine of literacy, which then turns back on the society and changes it. And that's why Steve's point about the comparatively free presses of Europe is so important. In the 18th century in China, a man who had the boldness to print the character for the emperor, which was illegal, was executed, and his entire family was sold into slavery. Now that's effective censorship. But in Europe, look, the famous case, a kind of amusing case, is Christopher Columbus, who shopped his idea of going west with a small fleet to England, to Italy's various Italians, to the Spaniards, and finally the Spanish crown financed his voyage. And whereas the Chinese were irritated by Japanese pirates, so to solve that problem, they moved the entire population of the coast of China 20 miles inland. Now, it's a complete.
And they ended their entire naval.
They had much better ships as late as the 15th century than the European so-called Chinese junks were the size of modern ocean liners. They were gigantic and very good. And then they said, no, we're not going to have any of that because the Central Power could do it. And the problem with tyranny in the absence of this many centers is that you get one person or a small group of people making all the decisions. And if they make a mistake, it's really bad. Whereas, I don't know, if Portugal does something bad, Spain can do something good.
But that's the second age that we are talking about. Now, just to conclude on this, it seems to me like you are saying we are moving into a third age, which will give us the benefit of unimaginable prosperity minus hierarchy.
That's right. But the danger is that statism is popular. And that's why it's so important that people get that it's not left and right. The left, I forget which I was calling the left, doesn't matter. I'll do it from my point of view now. The left and the right are both statist. The left wants to use the state to, in its view, to equalize people. The right wants to use the state to make the people good. So the left views ordinary citizens like you and me as sad. Oh, you poor thing, I'm going to help you. I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Although, that can take nasty forms too. And then the right says, you and I are bad. We're not Christian enough. Or we're not, we're bad. We're dangerous and bad. So we should send more police to stop you from being bad. Sad and bad. They still, both of them want big governments. They want this family model, either a sweet mother who's very indulgent, oh, you sad child, or a kind of tough father, oh, you bad child. That's what they want. Whereas we liberals, again, it's showed so well in the invasion of Ukraine, we say, no, the right axis is tyranny versus freedom.
Yeah. And I think it's worth emphasizing that we are, historically speaking, at a very special point in time.
Yeah.
Where so much good stuff had been accomplished.
You bet.
And I think that, one problem is that perhaps we are not grateful enough.
We're not grateful
for where
enough.
we are and how we got here. But you yourself in your life, in some ways, exemplify the broadening circles of empathy, the increasing toleration that, even though imperfect, is still significantly greater than what it was before. I joked with you before that 200 years ago, people would be chasing us around the village with pitchforks.
You and me both.
Yes, because we don't subscribe to, or rather, our lifestyles are not congruent with
Yeah, that's
mainstream.
right. That's right.
So I guess I would like to know more about your own journey, both intellectual. You called yourself a Marxist.
Yeah.
But also personal.
Well, I defined myself from age 11 on. When I finally got so I could tolerate it and was not so deeply ashamed, as a heterosexual crossdresser. I loved women. I was married for 30 years to the love of my life, Joanne. But every once in a while, I would cross-dress. That is, I would wear women's clothing secretly. And Joanne knew about it, and we kind of agreed that it's some little thing that Donald does. That was my name, Donald. And that we both construed it as no big deal. And that there are lots of men, it's rather common, who do this cross-dressing thing. Actually, the advantage of being an XX person, namely a born woman, is that you can cross-dress and no one cares. You can go around in blue jeans and a man's shirt, and they still say, "Oh, isn't that cute?" Whereas a man who wears a dress in public is going to be they're going to bring out the pitchforks. So it was a very successful marriage, a couple of kids, and in my 53rd year, I started to explore cross-dressing clubs, and surprise, surprise, most people don't know this, there are cross-dressing clubs in your town. And these men get together, and they're just guys, and they talk about the Chicago Bears or automobile repair, and they're guys. And occasionally they dress up as women. It's like, I don't know, a foot fetish or something. It's not very important. And then in my 53rd year, I started going to these clubs, and I realized it came on a September day in 1995. As the English say, I twigged. I got it. I realized that I was not a heterosexual crossdresser. I wanted to be a woman. Now look, every cell in my body says XY, XY, XY. You're a born man. And conservatives say, you shut up and be a man. And I didn't want that. And so, in a free society, I was able to change. Now, in 1995, when this happened, it was still somewhat unusual. There had been pioneers like Jan Morris, the Welsh journalist and travel writer and historian, who had done it 20 years before. But still in 1995, it was unusual. And thank God, now it's become rather commonplace. I say, well, I'm actually a trans woman. I was once Donald, now I'm Deirdre. And they say, oh, that's interesting. Say, how about those Yankees? They don't care anymore. Especially the young people don't care. It still has the capacity to shock people my age. I'm quite old. But not the kids.
That's a massive change.
It is.
I mean, certainly when it comes to acceptance of homosexuality, we saw tremendous change beginning perhaps in the late 1990s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
We tend to forget that the Lawrence decision came in 2003, I think.
Yeah.
That was a Texas sodomy decision.
Yeah.
And then after that, sort of things just start to snowball until a majority of Americans supports gay marriage and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously, when it comes to transsexualism, the the mental step that needs to be taken goes a step further. Sure. And therefore, one would say that here's another example of society just becoming much more tolerant. How did that come about, do you think?
It's another one of these spontaneous orders. We think of it in terms of law, and the law is important. Marriage between the races was illegal in the South, and even in Illinois, I believe, until quite late. But the spontaneous working of a liberal society. One of the big problems with these people, on my dear friends on the left, my dear friends on the right, is that they think society can be solved once for all. I think that's what we were driving at earlier when we were talking about this contrast between liberals and the left and the right. Liberals on the one hand, left on the right on the other. The liberals are in favor of experimentation. Piecemeal experimentation. Let's try this, let's try that. Oh, that's good, let's go with that. And that's how an economy actually progresses. And you're saying, quite correctly, that that's how a society progresses. Because I think it's a rather obvious ethical improvement that you don't jail male homosexuals. There are people on the right who would want to shoot me. And in Saudi Arabia, I'd be stoned to death. So it's the belief on the left and the right that each of them has the formula for the end of society. And to get Frank Fukuyama's point, the end of society, the end of politics, the end of history, he calls it, is actually an extremely creative, spontaneous order of liberalism. Whereas the left and the right say, no. We know what society should be like, and here's what it should be like. Shut up and do it.
And would you agree that the kernel of where we are today is basically 18th century understanding of liberty?
Very much so.
Because once you start expanding the circle of empathy, once you're starting bringing more and more people in, then whoever remains on the outside, it begins to look weird.
Of course it does.
And so at some point, once you internalize the notion that equality before the law is what is good, what we want to maintain and explore, then giving people the right to change their gender becomes just a...
Although it's crucial that equality before the law does not mean obey the law regardless, or whatever the law is just. There's a nice story. Didn't happen, I suppose, but it illustrates the point of an Indian, a South Asian, defending to a British administrator of the Raj the custom of sati, where the widow of the man who had just died would be cast into the flames of his funeral pyre, or encouraged to jump in. Okay, my husband's died, I can't live anymore, into the flames. And in the story, the Indian man says, well, don't you understand, oh British administrator, this is our custom. This is our law. And the administrator says, yes, geez, I understand that. I'm very sympathetic with this view. But you know, we have a law too, that people who throw people into the flames get hanged. So which law it is crucial. The law against interracial marriage, the law against gay marriage, the law against transgendered. For a long time there were, in the United States, of course it was a period. It was from the 1870s to the 1990s, as you point out. There was a period of rather fierce legislation against men dressing in public in women's clothing. All over the United States, there were these laws that the justification for the law was, in my mind, completely insane. It was viewed or it was defended as this would be terrible because then people could hold up banks and then change their clothing and you wouldn't be able to catch them. That was their justification. But of course, what it was really about is revulsion at a man crossing this gender barrier. It was never really a problem for women crossing the gender barrier, although there was kind of gentle jokes about it, but not anything very serious, whereas it was illegal all over the United States. And then those laws were overturned. So equal justice under law, I'd put the emphasis on equality of permission under law. Under law, because there got to be laws. I agree with you. But not all laws are not created equal. But you're absolutely right that the kind of germ of it all is, in the phrase of Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. And at the time he wrote it in 1776, it had become among advanced intellectuals in the West a commonplace. It was not that he thought it up. It goes back to Locke and so forth, and it's not. It wasn't that shocking an idea. But of course, the problem was that Tom owned slaves, and he owned slaves who were his children by Sally Hemings. And on his death in 1826, he didn't free them. He didn't free his own children. So it was slow coming, but as you said, the absurdity of one person owning another, having just said that they're equal, became more and more evident. And slavery was not quite the first one. It was in the United States, it was the second one. The first one in the United States was freeing poor men to vote. Property qualifications were very popular with the Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton. And that same Jefferson said, no. Or he said more exactly, everyone should have property and then they should vote because they would have independence. But then slavery became the great embarrassment. Then in 1848, the women said, wait a second, we've been very active in the anti-slavery movement, in a gathering in Seneca, New York. What about us? And slowly, finally, women got the vote. In some Swiss cantons, they didn't get the vote until 20 years ago.
1991, I think.
1991, there you are, about 30 years ago.
What's your message for the young people out there?
Well, the young people is to what's my message for the young people out there?
Based on where you've come from, what you have seen.
Work hard, but look, when I'm advising young transgendered people, I don't do it a lot, but I sometimes do, I'm called on to do it, I say, look, don't think that your gender transition is going to solve all your problems. It's not. You'll be ecstatically happy if you're a man when you were a woman, or a woman when you were a man and you wanted to do it on that score. But what you should do is work hard at your day job. Get educated. Move to a free country if you're in a place that isn't free. I actually, come to think of it, I'm thinking of a Iranian man who wants to transition. I don't want to reveal too much about him. He's a journalist, and I helped him a little bit. I don't want to say that I was the great savior here, but I helped him get admitted to Spain, where he can transition if he wants. And so that's the kind of advice I give. Find a free society, a liberal society, move from, I don't want to characterize it too much, from a conservative state to a really liberal state inside the United States, and pursue your dreams, I guess is the Hollywood cliche way of putting it. But pursuing your dreams means taking responsibility. So take responsibility for your life. Don't blame your parents on it. Go for it.
We don't talk a lot about responsibility these days, but I think it's so fundamental to understand that if freedom is to work, it needs to be accompanied by responsibility.
Absolutely, I completely agree. By the way, the very word responsibility is very new. It was not used this way in English or in any other language until it started to be used the way we use it now. It's a very big word now. Responsibility is really important. Around 1800. It came out of legal jargon. The older version of it, as you can find out, it was that you must respond to a court order. That's what it meant. And by 1800, it had started to become this enormous take responsibility for your own life and go for it.
Well, I hope that a lot of people in the world have the sort of freedom that we have in our lives.
Yeah.
In America in 2022, it may not be a perfect society, but it is much better than many, many other places in the world, and certainly much better than what it used to be.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this wonderful interview. I much appreciate it. Maybe we'll get to do another one sometime in the future.
I hope so too. I'm very, have mouth will talk. Although I'm fond of saying that there's a reason God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. You learn more by listening to what the other's saying and then responding than just making one speech after another.
I fully agree. Thank you.
Thank you, dear.